Thank you very much, Steve. I really do think you've covered most of the critical issues, and what's really be interesting is to see what are the consequences, what are the lessons, and what are the ways forward that we can identify based upon that. But let me make a couple of comments before we actually get to that. And that is, if you take a look at what we mean by corporate social responsibility as giving way to commercial strategies, one of the things that I think it'd be really interesting for all of us to consider is, what do we mean by commercial strategies? I remember there was an insurance company who we were talking about their response to the Pakistan floods. And I said, well, why did you get involved? And they said, you know, you cannot believe what it's like sitting where we're sitting and having our staff come up to us and saying, well, what are you doing about the floods in Pakistan? Obviously, many of their employees came from South Asia. But the point really is, what do we mean by commercial strategies? And the internal aspect of the commercial, if you like, entity is also something that has to be borne in mind. So if I can just sort of move on to this whole question of business must find ways in which they can use humanitarian operations to earn profits or grow a band. Yes, deeply important, but I think it has to be, to some extent, qualified by the extent that we're not just there to earn profits directly. And what you have to really understand is our concept of sustainability. And I think Steve has touched on that, but I think it's a very important point to bear in mind. It is not just the profit. It is what is the value chain that gets me to that profit? What requirements, what responsibilities do I have to my employees, to the assets which they depend upon as well as we? So I think when one talks about the grow a brand or profits, one has to, if you like, start not necessarily at the profit level, but rather what gets me there. I think also this question of core technical capacities, which is so deeply important, and I think really does bring out, why do we engage? What are your value addeds? What are your comparative advantages that makes our partnership useful? I'd like to just take that one step beyond just core technical capacities. One of the things that I think more and more that we'll see is that the access that business increasingly has to government will also be a capacity that we can use as well. So I think it's that kind of relationship. We start off indeed with technical capacities, but let's also bear in mind that there are other capacities that one should also take a look at. This whole question of scalable and sustainable solutions is deeply important. I think that in a sense speaks for itself. But I think as we get to, and what are we supposed to do with all of this? You have to say, well, what is the forum? What is the platform in which we can scale up? And that's the challenge. And so I think we all agree, and I think the study is so right when it says we must scale up. But what is the platform that we have to scale up with? Thank you, Steve. Now, I don't think anyone is going to be totally overwhelmed by our findings. But I think, Steve, you and I felt that one just had to say it again. And that is that what are the contacts that aid agencies have with the private sector? And for those of you who have worked overseas and had to deal with emergencies, etc., let me ask you, what is the forum that you had to engage with the private sector? To what extent did they come to, let's say, a cluster meeting? To what extent, when you have the expanded interagency standing committee, the in-country ISCs, did you say, well, shall we talk about what we might be able to do together? And I'm sort of looking to see if there's, no, I don't see anybody saying, but in my country office. So I think that really is a very fundamental question. We have not used the mechanisms of our own system, nor have we used the mechanisms of, quote unquote, the private sector system, the chambers of commerce, the national organizations that bring together these industrial and, if you like, commercial organizations. And here, too, is something that, as we get to what all this means, I think we'll have to consider. What are the recommendations then? In terms of awareness, again, Steve has touched on it, but let me just re-emphasize that it's really fascinating to see what we don't know about the capacities of those whom we could work with. What are the value addeds? What are the comparative advantages that you have in engaging with a particular community? You might know more about that community, if you like, as an extractive industry, and I use that with a certain degree of hesitation, than I perhaps do from my humanitarian development perspective. So my question is, how aware are we of the comparative advantages and the value addeds of the business community, but also them of ourselves? And then, you know, I think, Steve, I'm sure everyone has heard this before, but basically, you can't trust the business sector. And I can assure you, the business sector, you really can't trust those humanitarians. Somehow now, this all has to go back to the recommendations. What can we do to bring this together, to break down barriers, to say, we actually need to talk to each other? And I do remember the representative of a Dutch company, when we were going over this several years ago and saying, you know, what is the problem with the private sector? They don't seem to understand our values. They don't seem to have, if you like, principles. And a furious representative of, it's now too much time has gone, so I can't say it, British Petroleum stood up and said, who do you think you are? We have principles. It's just that you don't have our principles. Attitudes. We have to figure out how to engage. And then finally, that moment that you've all been waiting for, okay, what are we going to do about this? And let me just then say, I think part of it is to establish forums for business and aid agencies. But bear in mind, that is a fundamental and deeply important point. But do you know how many such platforms, forum already exist? Have you bothered to take a look in Southeast Asia, in Latin America, the platforms that are already out there? So the question that I think this poses is, not merely do we have to establish, but we have to use what's out there. What I think will be really interesting for you as you begin to consider establishing and using these platforms are, who's there? How do we get in, if you like, local companies? How do we get in the multinational? How do we get in other peoples who would actually be useful for this forum and still have it practical? So in other words, what we don't need is another health cluster kind of thing in Haiti where we had 400 representatives, all, if you like, willing to make a contribution. My point is, how do you select, how do you determine, and how do you run and organize this, and how do you use what is already out there? I think foster mutual understanding is deeply important. Like all of these things, it's a personal thing, it's a one-on-one thing, it's not a system, it's not, if you like, a mechanistic thing. And the question is, how do you do it? I would have thought, and now if I can put on my UN hat, I would have thought we have tremendous mechanisms to do this, and I mentioned them earlier. The cluster system. Why isn't there a water specialist that comes from Unilever in Ghana and, if you like, getting involved in our cluster? Similarly, would it be interesting to have a kind of platforms or a kind of times or opportunities where the country teams, the NGO representatives, UN representatives, et cetera, actually engage with the private sector? So my question is, we need to look for those. They're out there. If you take a look at the study, it gives you indications of what kind of things we mean. But basically, it's not a question necessarily of a mechanistic solution. It's a question of people getting out there and engaging. Now, I think that quite clearly then fits into helping change the anti-business culture prevalent in some aid agencies. And dare I say, there's the other side of that. And I think somehow we have to convince the private sector that we also have value within the aid and humanitarian system. So again, I think it's this dialogue. But maybe a starting point is for aid agencies to actually invite in, have discussions with, engagement with private sector on the basis not of corporate social responsibility, not of philanthropy, because that's where we started, but really, what's our respective value addeds? What are our respective comparative advantages? And then finally, let me just mention, in a sense, a note of caution. If one thinks that basically this is all about how can we engage, I think that's very important. But the note of caution is this. I don't think that you can assume that aid agencies and business groupings necessarily will always resist government's inclinations to say it's probably better to work with this private sector in these situations than this amalgam of aid agencies with their principles, with their publicity, etc. Let's get someone there, a company, who has a vested interest in our country over time. To which you might say, well, is that really real? And my question to you is, if you take a look at the changing nature, as Steve has said, of the way governments try increasingly to deal with their own crises, the tendency might very well be that the private sector might be, on the one hand, a partner, but on the other hand, an alternative. So with that, thank you very much and look forward to getting everyone's reactions.
Thank you very much, Steve and Randolph. Plenty of food for thought there, I think. Before I introduce our other speakers, I should have told you at the beginning the hashtag for this event is hashtag business4aid, for the number. So please feel free to tweet as we go on.